So my name again is Rodney Lusk. I'm your lead district supervisor. Delighted to welcome you here to our town hall. This is our virtual town hall meeting on the budget. Many of you were a part of our original town hall, which was held when we could actually meet in person. We had an opportunity to talk about the budget at that time, which was the county executive's advertised 2021 budget, which was about a month or so ago. A lot has changed since then. This pandemic has kind of upended a number of things, including the global economy or national economy. Now the impacts are kind of coming down to the local economy. So as a result of that, our county executive and Joe Monduro and his team have had to kind of go look at the budget, kind of scrub through it, and they've made some changes, which they just posted yesterday. What I'd like to say is, we have to recognize that there's a significant loss in revenues that the county will be recognizing as a result of, closure of business. We have a pretty active travel and tourism program here in the county, so we're not going to be collecting receipts from our transient occupancy tax in the same way that we have in the past. Our sales and use taxes, pretty much all of our fees, they're all down. So as a result of that, the county executive has proposed a new budget. We'll be hearing from Joe Monduro here in just a couple of minutes on the details around it. But I think recognizing that we are in a different situation than we were when the first budget was announced, there have been some changes, removing some of the increased tax rate, changing the fees that were originally included in the original FY21 budget. Those have all been taken out, and I'll say we're going to really have to look at the budget in a different way, and our intention going forward is to have quarterly reviews, so we'll be able to see what revenues has the county recognized. If we are above what we anticipated, we might have some flexibility to look at basically bringing on some additional services. If we're not able to do that, meaning not recognize additional revenue, then we might have to actually make some additional cuts at that time. But we're going to do this kind of on a quarter by quarter basis and recognize that, there's a lot of uncertainty at this time. And I want to commend everyone for what they're doing with social distancing and really trying to make sure we kind of slow the spread so we can get through this kind of curve cycle and then get back to hopefully business as usual as soon as possible. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Joe Monduro so he can give us some additional details relative to the budget, and we'll have the opportunity to hear your questions and start answering those myself and Mr. Monduro. So thank you, Joe, for being a participant, and thank you for all the work that you're doing with the county to address this kind of uncertain time.
Thank you, Supervisor Lusk, and thanks for the invitation to participate this morning. As you've already indicated, the county executive released his budget typical to the normal schedule at the end of February. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it, but just to say, and I think the board was very pleased with the significant initiatives that were able to be funded as part of that budget. Unfortunately, given the dynamic that you've described and that everyone's aware of, we've made a number of changes, as you indicated, to that budget. I also want to point out that this budget that we're talking about begins July 1. As we've seen over the last 30 days, 45 days, a lot can change in a very short period of time. And so one of the other things that we need to take into account as we're talking about the county's budget is those things that we're doing in the current fiscal year. We're in fiscal year 2020.
Right.
That goes through June 30th. The board adopted that budget in very different times. They do have before them our third quarter review for FY 2020. And as I'm talking about the 21 budget, I'll refer back to the third quarter budget because there are some adjustments that we've made as part of that discussion to also respond to the current dynamic. As Supervisor Lusk indicated, the county executive has released a new proposed budget for FY21 that came out on Tuesday, late on Tuesday. I apologize for that. We were scrambling to get all the details put together, but it is available. It's on the county's website. It is a much more concise document than our typical budget document. It's about 30 pages, focusing really high-level information on what the recommendation is. And so I'll just go through that at a high level again, refer back to third quarter as appropriate, and then stop and we'll take your questions.
Right.
So as you've already heard, in terms of some of the detail that Supervisor Lusk referenced, there is no recommended increase in the real estate tax rate for FY21. As part of the original budget, there were actually two pieces associated with real estate. One was a 2-cent increase for the general fund, and one was a 1-cent increase in support of affordable housing. Both of those recommendations have been removed from the table. In addition, there was recommendation to impose an admissions tax of 4%. There were a number of other adjustments in taxes and fees for other funds. We typically talk about the general fund when we're talking about the annual budget process, but that's really only half of the county's budget. There are other funds for things like wastewater, stormwater, solid waste. There were recommendations for increases in wastewater and solid waste as part of the February budget. Those have also been removed. And so essentially we're going into FY21 on the general fund side with flat revenues over FY 2020. And there are a number of pieces to that. The first is that, as you all know, the real estate tax is driven by a two-part equation. The first is your assessments, and the second is the rate. So as you've heard, the rate is not increasing for FY21, but assessments, and you all know this from the assessment notices that you received in February, have changed as a result of the normal process for residential assessments. The evaluation that's done by tax administration staff is based on the sales that have occurred from January 1 to December 31st of the year that just ended. That's required by state code in terms of that calculation. For commercial properties, it's a little bit different because the transactions, there's not as many sales, et cetera, in commercial properties. So there's a much higher reliance on vacancy rates, on the rents that are being charged. That's all, again, based on that historical information from January 1 through December 31st. Clearly, a lot has changed between those assessments being done. But again, by state code, the basis for the assessments is that data. And so there are increases in real estate tax bills as a result of those assessment changes. The assessments grew by a little over 3%. On average, for the residential homeowner, that's about $172 a year. And as we say, each year. And so there's some continuity with previous budget discussions, although not a lot. But as we say every year, there's really nobody in the audience who is the average homeowner, because that's sort of the aggregate value of all in the county and the average increase applied to that. But if you have a home that's close to that value, the increase is about $172. It's going to depend for your individual case on your home value and on the changes in your neighborhood. So that average percent increase is also in the aggregate. As a result of the adjustment in assessments, there's a little over $100 million in additional revenue from FY 2020 that is available for FY 21. However, there are a number of other categories where we are seeing and we're projecting declines. Part of the challenge with this dynamic is that the timing of the data coming in is lagging. And so, for example, sales tax, as I think everyone would expect, would be a category that would be impacted by the virus. The data that we have is January sales, sort of preceding the major impacts that are going to occur in sales tax. We're not going to get March data before the middle of May. And in fact, based on state collection, it may be later than that. And so we're making some projections based on some assumptions and some more general regional and national indicators. But one of the reasons, as Supervisor Lusk indicated, that this process going forward is going to be a much more continuous one is that those data points are going to continue to change as we proceed through the coming weeks and months. And I'll talk about the calendar at the end, but just wanted to reemphasize that. This our second attempt at the FY21 is certainly not going to be the last. There are going to be opportunities for the board and the community as we go forward in the coming months to respond to whatever the changing dynamic is at that point in time. And hopefully we'll have some additional data to help us with that. But we'll also be seeing how the trends in other places are going based on sort of how they are moving through the curve. So again, in terms of the revenue, basically flat because that $100 million in real estate is offset by those reductions in other categories that we're projecting at this point. Sales tax, transient occupancy are among some of the major ones. We are professional staff in budget office, tax administration are using their collective best judgment relative to these estimates. But I can guarantee that the numbers that we're presenting right now are going to change over the course of the next coming months, and we'll be looking at that. So as a result of that, there's obviously a need to recast the expenditure side of the budget as well. We're going from an increase for the general fund, for example, of about $159 million in February to essentially zero. And so what we've done is essentially backed out any of the non-critical, non-essential, and I know those words are being overused in the current dynamic, anything that is not something that the board has already moved forward on or that is tied specifically to our response to coronavirus or the needs of our most vulnerable populations. And so, for example, as we look at the proposal for FY21 that's been revised, in February, we had increases totaling 177 positions. In this new budget, we have 20. And of those, 19 of them are in the health department. There's one that's related to elections, because we do have a national election coming in November. But the other 19 are in the health department. A number of them are specifically focused on coronavirus. A number of them are tied to school health, and they are consistent with a long-term plan that we have. But the reason that we kept them in is that, as you can imagine, in the current dynamic with schools being closed, all of those school health nurses, which are county employees that are in the health department, have been redeployed to assist with corona. So these positions that are in school health will also, as long as the pandemic continues, will be redeployed by the health department in support of pandemic. In addition, there are other epidemiologists and other public health positions included in those 19 that are in the health department. So you can get, I think, a pretty good example of the shift from February to now, going from 177 positions to 21. Just a little bit of reference relative to the things that were in February and are not in now. We had, as many of you in Lee might be interested in, the second to the last tranche of positions for the new South County Police Station. We've been funding and filling those positions over a number of years because, as you can imagine, it takes some time to recruit and train officers. Based on the calendar and the anticipated completion of the South County Station, what we've decided is, not rather than putting those positions in FY21, we'll shift them to 22. They'll still be available for the opening of the station, but that's an example where we've moved from sort of our planned strategic approach to a much more constrained approach. One of the other big categories of interest, typically, as we talk about the budget, is schools. The board has, for many, many years, identified the schools as their top priority and identified the need for the county and schools to essentially share the revenue growth. And so, unfortunately, as part of a shift from $159 million in additional revenues to basically zero, that's changed the dynamic of the transfer in schools very significantly. We had about $85 million in the February budget. There's $7 million in this revised budget. And the reason that there's $7 million, when, again, I've said a couple times we've got zero revenue, is there are some expenditure savings that we've identified, specifically on the county side as it relates to compensation, and then more broadly as it relates to our reserve contributions. Our reserve contributions are based on the growth in the budget. With the budget not growing, there's not a need to contribute those reserves to those reserves. And so there's some savings there, and that results in the funding that's available for schools. Just one more note on schools. As you all know from participating in these discussions, in Fairfax, the schools are supported in very large part by the general fund. 52.7% of the general fund goes to schools. 73% of the school budget comes from the county. This year was very positive for schools relative to the state budget. But just like we're reexamining our budget, the state is going to be reexamining their budget. And so there'll probably be some changes on that front as well for schools. The county gets relatively small dollars from the state in our budget, but the schools does get in the 20-25% range for their budget. And so that dynamic is going to continue to unfold as we go forward. One of the other significant categories, significant issues that we talk about with the budget each year is employee pay. We had a fully funded employee pay increase package in the February budget. All of that has been taken out of the county executive's revised budget. And the focus of the revised budget is on maintaining core services and maintaining the existing staff that we have. And so again, reducing new staff and reducing pay increases is part of that posture. There are lots of other, little details about the budget that if people have questions about, we can go through. But I think that'll stop, and I'll stop there in terms of my overall comments about the budget proposal, with the exception of one comment about reserves. And so, as I said, our policies, very deliberate, comprehensive policies that the board has adopted over many years, provides a formula for making contributions to reserves. Similarly, there are rules relative to how those reserves can be accessed. We have, since 2015, made some significant increases in our reserve levels. We have a policy of about 10%, and we're about 10% funded in 21. And so that's very significant and important as we look at this dynamic unfolding for a number of months. Based on the way those reserves are accessed, and based on the recommendations that the county executive made on Tuesday, we are not accessing those reserves as part of this action. However, we anticipate that as the discussion continues and as triggers are met, for example, our revenue stabilization reserve can be accessed if in the existing budget year, so not as part of budget development, but once we get past July 1st, for example, so as part of carryover action, if revenues have decreased from the budget by 1.5%, and in combination with expenditure reductions, we would make a recommendation to access that revenue stabilization fund. So having built up those reserves over the last 5 years is a very important position for us to have as we go forward over the next, hopefully, months, not longer than that. So in terms of the budget, I'll stop there, but I'll just talk a little bit about the calendar. So based on the original calendar, we were intending to have public hearings starting next Tuesday, the 14th, continuing on the 15th and the 16th. For a number of reasons, including recognizing that the community now has a brand new budget to look at, but also recognizing that we want to make sure that those public hearings are held in a way that's maximizing safety for both the community and staff. We've shifted those to the 28th, 29th, and 30th, and they will be entirely virtual, as opposed to the more traditional everybody coming to the government center and testifying in the packed auditorium. What we will be doing for the opportunities for commenting on the budget is really threefold. The first is we've got a robust online application that's now up and running, a little bit different from our previous applications where you had a limited number of words put in. Is basically just a free flow narrative. You can attach documents, you can attach graphics, anything that you want to make your point. All that information will be shared with the entire board. We will continue what we started, I think, 2, maybe 3 years ago, of accommodating YouTube videos being uploaded and presented to the board. That will continue. We have had relatively light use of that option in the past. I would anticipate that this year that'll change. Yeah. And then finally, we have a new option to replace the in-person, which is a telephone option. So on the 28th, 29th, and 30th, based on the speaker list, staff will be calling the residents who have signed up to testify and who want to do that via phone. Call them, and they'll be broadcast over to the entire board in their remote locations and over Channel 16 to the community as well. So again, transitioning that process. Obviously, one of the means of providing input is in meetings like this and in the emails and calls that you make to your individual board member, and so that'll continue. Obviously, these meetings have taken a little bit of a different flavor from the in-person to the group. As a result of shifting the public hearings, we're shifting some other dates as well. In the original schedule, the budget would have been adopted by May 5th. What we're doing now, because we shifted the public hearings 2 weeks, we're shifting what we call markup from April 28th to May 5th, just a week. But what that does is that provides the community basically with a lay of the land of the decisions the board's making. And then budget adoption was on the 5th. That's going to be shifted to May 12th. That's really signing and sealing all of the legal documents. The real decisions are communicated at markup. And again, that will be on May 5th with adoption on May 12th. By state code, we have to have a budget adopted by May 15th. So we're just getting in ahead of that. The schools then will finalize their budget. They have their round of public hearings on May 11th, 12th, and 13th, I believe, and then their adoption is within a week or two of the May 15th date. So again, all of those things shifting in response to sort of this dynamic. Specific to coronavirus in third quarter, just wanted to mention a couple of things. And so just like on the revenue side, things are in flux and we have relatively limited data. We're not exactly sure what the trajectory is going to be in terms of expenditures either. And so what we've done for both third quarter and FY21 is put aside reserves specific to coronavirus. And there are a couple of very specific things that are called out for those reserves to fund. First is obviously expenses that are directly related to dealing with the impact of the virus, whether that's something as simple as cleaning supplies for facilities to something perhaps more complex, but very, very important. Our ability to assist our nonprofit partners and to address some of the needs of small businesses, especially in the community. And so there are, again, reserves in both third quarter, about $12 million, and FY21, about $10 million. We anticipate that's going to grow as we move through carryover and mid-year. But right now, those are the numbers that have been identified. And in addition, there is a board item for the April 14th meeting, which will request that the board approve a new small business loan program that will actually access one of our reserves that I haven't mentioned yet, which is our EOR, our Economic Opportunity Reserve, which is not only specifically in place to bolster our reserve posture, but is also there to provide a place for the board to go for issues like this. When we established the reserve, when the board established the reserve in 2015, we certainly didn't envision coronavirus. But what we did envision was the need to go to a funding source to address economic opportunities. And so in the shift as part of the April 14th action will be to use those dollars to provide loans to small businesses. And we have, again, those other reserves to deal with those issues as well. So with that, I think I'll stop talking and Supervisor Lusk, I don't know if you've had anything to add.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much for that overview. It's extremely helpful.
All right. Well, we're going to move into the question and answer period now. Thanks a lot for that, Joe. It prompted more than a couple questions, so we're going to jump right into it. But before I do that, I just want to welcome anyone who might have joined late. I know we had a transition. We're taking your questions in the Ask a Question section at the bottom of the page, so make sure to drop them in there. If you're having technical issues, let us know about it in the chat. Our staff will try to help you. And also, we've gone ahead. You'll see a little button now that's come up at the bottom of your screen. That will take you straight in a new tab while keeping the town hall open to the updated budget proposal document. So if you'd like to reference that at any time during the town hall, that's available to you. So I'm going to start out by apologizing to Avis. I know, Avis, we had said we were going to give you the first question, but we need a little bit more detail because you wanted us to read it, and I'm not sure there's enough there for us to be able to answer. So if you want to come on video and ask the question, we'd be happy to invite you. Or if you want to email it to leedist@fairfaxcounty.gov, we'll make sure to get back to you. So we're going to move. I'm going to read a question from Mario Alejandro, who asked that we read his question, and I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Mario's question is, I'm very concerned about the lack of services for uninsured and lower income population of Fairfax County. Many of them are receiving nothing under the CARES Act. Looks like there is maybe $580,000 provided to community services, which is a drop in the bucket. How much will you advocate to provide? These people face a greater risk of infection and death and will infect us all too.
Okay, so thank you for that question. I'll start by saying we heard Joe mention the Economic Opportunity Reserve Fund earlier in this presentation, and I would argue that that's a fund that will also have some capability of supporting our not-for-profits to help address some of the issues that we're seeing in our community. So I'm going to certainly be advocating for the deployment of that. As a matter of fact, I made a point that we should be looking at ways to use that fund even before this crisis got to where it is. And I would argue now, in light of all the changes that have happened, we need it even more. Secondarily, we'll be working very closely. Our Deputy County Executive for Human Services, Tisha Deegan, is working very closely with our not-for-profits. We have a consolidated funding pool. I've been asking questions around that in terms of giving those not-for-profits some flexibility to, deploy some of the funding that they've been previously approved for other purposes to deploy that for this COVID related needs. So that could be for food or health or some of the other issues that you've raised. So I think we're going to have to kind of be thinking creatively here, and the board has asked the county executive to kind of come back with some recommendations. So the first is, as you heard earlier, is we'll be looking at this kind of loan / possibly grant program, and then we'll also be looking at our consolidated funding pool, and then we'll be looking at ways to support our not-for-profits, as they're kind of on the front line and they're doing a lot of this delivery of service and meeting these gaps in the needs that we see as a result of this pandemic. So we'll be focused on it, and I'll say this, stay tuned. We'll have some additional information that we'll share on it.
So I would just add a couple of points, if I could, Matt. First of all, as I said, part of this dynamic is the timing. And so our conversation relative to the FY21 budget really is addressing the budget that starts on July 1. Let me finish with that period, and then I'll go back to really, I think, some of the information that's more relevant to your question. I appreciate the specifics of the question. That $580,000 that you're talking about is the increase to the funding pool that's included in the recommendation for FY21. And that was included in February, and we've maintained it for this revised budget. What that is, though, is, again, it's an increase. And so the funding pool awards are made every 2 years and are in the, as part of the 21 budget, in the $14+ million range. And so it's not an insignificant investment in a lot of the needs that you're describing. Certainly, the needs that were identified by the nonprofit community when they made application to the funding pool earlier in the year are different than the needs that are focused, that we need to focus on right now. And part of what Supervisor Lusk is referring to is revisiting by staff of those recommendations that were made sort of pre-coronavirus to identify where we need to shift the priorities and what additional revenues we need to add to that $14 million amount, which again includes the 580. Some of the reserve that I talked about would be used for that. One of the things that I didn't mention and should have, so this reminded me, thank you, is there have been identified by the federal government a number of resources to address responses to coronavirus. There are some significant funds that are going to flow to local governments. Right now, it looks like those are mostly designed to reimburse us for costs. It may be, and there's a move in Congress led by Representative Conley to also allow those resources to replace some of the revenues that we're losing. In addition to that sort of large pot, there are funds that HUD has released relative to funds that could flow to nonprofits serving the community that you're talking about, the individual you're talking about, as well as some other smaller pots. And so we're working all of that through. But again, that's really focused in terms of those resources like from HUD on FY21. For FY20, that $11 million, almost $12 million reserve that I talked about for third quarter is in place. In addition, county direction to our nonprofit partners and certainly to county agencies is we built the 20 budget based on what was known at that point, and there are awards and programs that are in place that right now can't even be accomplished because facilities are closed, kids aren't in schools, for example, and so those dollars are being redirected as well to serve the needs, like you mentioned, like other basic needs in terms of food, rent relief, et cetera, to help those individuals in the community that perhaps have lost their jobs. So there's a very dynamic that's in play right now to address not only the current needs, but also anticipate some of the needs as we move into the next fiscal year.
Thanks for that, Joe. So I'm going to move now to a question that was upvoted. So I'm going to skip some people online, and I apologize about that. But because this question was voted straight to the top, I'm going to go ahead and read it. This question is from Mary Payton, and Mary unfortunately had to leave a little early, so she asked that we read it. And before I do read the question, I'll just give a heads up to Diane Alejandro. You'll be getting a prompt. We'll be inviting you to ask your question next. Mary Payton's question is, how can we ensure housing security for low-income renters who were laid off over the next few months?
So included in the funding that the county provides for basic needs, we do have funds that flow through our 221 system, which is basically where folks call into the county and identify that they have a need, whether it's for housing, for rent relief, for utility relief, for food. And then we coordinate with the nonprofit, either using our funds or funds that are provided to the nonprofit that are in that region that the individual is calling from. As you can imagine, the volume of the calls at this time is increasing dramatically. And so while there are initial dollars, baseline dollars that are in place, again, what we're looking at is supplementing those with these other funds from reserves, et cetera, to meet those needs. The number of folks who are having the need and the length of time that they're having the need are both growing. And so that's a big part of the equation. Again, as Supervisor Lusk indicated, there's a lot of work being done, especially within Health and Human Services, to identify those partners in the community that can work with us the most closely to make that as effective as possible.
Yeah, if I could add one more point on that as well, and that is, I know that a number of you have been supporting our local not-for-profits, so thank you for your contributions to them. That's very important and significant. I would say, volunteering and support of those not-for-profits is also critical at this time. One of the groups that we work with pretty closely here in South County, United Community, is just seeing record numbers of people coming in for food, record numbers of people asking for financial support. It's just beginning to blossom, and I think this is going to continue, as as we're going through this peak in the curve. So continue doing what you can, and appreciate the efforts that the community is making.
Okay, we're going to go to Diane Alejandro for the next question. And Diane, before we do that, I'll let Keith Fox know that we'll be coming to your question next, Keith, and it looks like we'll be reading that one. So over to you, Diane.
Hi, thanks. In full disclosure, I do not live in your district, but we do have members in ACLU People Power Fairfax who do. So I'm sort of standing in for them.
Sure.
Really appreciate this opportunity. My question is, I know we're talking about mainly the July budget, but the crisis with COVID-19 is going on now. And some people are getting money from the federal government, others are not. For example, immigrants in Fairfax are not getting money if they have one undocumented member in their family and undocumented don't get unemployment. So everyone's safety net is broken at this point. Why does this not qualify as a catastrophe for which you can access the managed reserve fund? The last data I saw was that there's about 185 million in that fund. You can replenish it later when you get money from the federal government, but the idea of just waiting until we have money is going to increase deaths and illness and cause all sorts of economic stress.
Thanks, Diane. I'm going to turn it over to Joe and Rodney to answer your question. Really appreciate you joining us.
So I'll start, Supervisor Lusk, if that's okay. I think, I'd answer that in a couple of different ways. I think that the uncertainty associated with this whole dynamic is such that we are trying to be deliberate, but also providing the flexibility that's needed based on the information we have. And so for the current fiscal year, which is really what you're talking about, the current budget year, again, we've got those reserves that have been put in place that are appropriated and that are ready to be spent for these issues. We've freed up flexibility as it relates to the funding to our nonprofit partners. And so if they were, running a facility-based program that now is closed, they can shift those resources to other opportunities for addressing needs in the community. The other point that I think is really, really relevant is the dynamic is going to change, as we've talked about a number of times. And so being very clear about the fact that we are going to be very regularly looking at what the new dynamic is and whether we need to supplement the resources that have been already identified. It doesn't mean this is a one-time shot. We're going to identify what we think we need now. We're going to continue to look at that as those resources are tapped. We're going to replenish them. And I think that the issue of the specific access of the reserve is an important one to address, but is one that I think we need to address very cautiously, because we don't know how steep the curve is going to go, when the most dramatic impacts are going to be. And so if we go to those reserves first, then we have no place else to go. So we're using the other tools that we have at our disposal first, again, reevaluating to make sure that we've put enough in at this point in time. If we need to add more, we can. We've got, in addition to the reserves that I specifically talked about, the county has been very deliberate over decades in funding various parts of the organization for those specific needs. And the classic example is our fuel reserve. It is certainly not an issue today, given fuel prices. Yeah. Several years ago, when fuel prices were spiking and then dropping and spiking, we put in a reserve of $4 million that is absolutely not needed right now. I would anticipate that as sort of our next round of identification of options, and that probably will happen when the board starts talking about their action on third quarter. We typically provide updates to the board, even during the development of the budget and during the discussion of the budget and during the discussion on third quarter. That reserve, which is $4 million, and others, if we need to supplement the funding for our partners for assistance in the community, that's one of the places we would go. So we've got those tools at our disposal, and we'll be communicating with the board as needed as we go forward to make sure that we're not in a position where we don't have the resources to meet the needs that are facing us.
And I'll add here that if there's information that we should be aware of as a member of the board, I want to be, clued in if there are needs in the community that are not being addressed. So specifically sharing that information with me would be certainly helpful as we're making decisions around how to appropriate funds. People should be definitely reaching out to the county through the CSP model, calling. We'll provide a number for them if they're not familiar with it. We want to make sure that anyone that needs assistance is kind of coming into our system so we can account for them and find out where there might be some inadequacies. And then I would say, we've really got to think about, how we will use these funds in the future. And I'm a person who believes that if there's a problem, then we've got to try to find a solution to it. And if it gets to a point where we can't manage this through our other, sub-fund expenditures that have not been appropriated, then we'll have an opportunity to pull those funds in, as Joe has indicated. So please, if there's data that we should be aware of, please share that with us. And then the last thing I'll say, working with the folks, Tisha Deegan and others in NCS, they're the ones who are on the front lines with the not-for-profits trying to figure out how to help them kind of bridge during this time. So clearly making sure the nonprofits are talking directly to them about their specific needs. And if there's, a need for more flexibility and reappropriating funds that have been designated for some other purpose, we want to be sensitive to ensuring that flexibility is able to be used. So keep us posted, and we'll keep you aware of the things that we learn as well.
Okay, I'm going to read the next question that came in from Keith L. Fox, and I'll give a heads up to Nicole Miller. We'll be inviting you to ask a question next, so keep an eye out for that, Nicole. And then after that, we'll be reading Eric I'm sorry, Eric, I'm not going to say your name right. Eric Goplerd's question after that. So Keith's question is... I'm sorry, excuse me, Joshua. Keith's question is, can we allocate more money to sidewalks and trails? The quality of life improves if people can walk safely and bike more. We should be more aggressive with this. I recommend that one fiscal year we allocate all funds intended for roadway reconstruction projects to sidewalks and trails. Be bold. Thanks, Keith.
So I'll start on this one, I think. So and I'll be honest in saying, one of the first things as a board matter that I got to work on as a new member of the board was with Walter Alcorn. We recognized that there were some issues with pedestrian safety, and part of that, and also bicycle safety, recognizing that people, don't have access in some cases to sidewalk segments, and also recognizing that we need to think through use of technology as a way to make our roads and our transportation network a little bit safer. So we are advocating for the county to identify places where we might make changes to adding additional striping for bicycle lanes. Also looking particularly on the historic Richmond Highway corridor, where we've had the highest incidence of pedestrian fatalities of any place in Fairfax County and possibly also in the Commonwealth, to look at ways to make it a safer place for people to kind of cross and not lose their lives in doing that. So we are sensitive to this, and I'll say we'll continue to work with the Department of Transportation. So right now, Tom Bishadny is conducting a study. He's briefed us on an interim status that they are doing additional research. They'll be coming back with some recommendations. So we'll be able to share information about that once we've received the Department of Transportation's report. But this is an issue we certainly care about. And I think in Lee District, we've got a number of places where there are bicycle trails, and we're currently finishing a sidewalk segment along Telegraph Road that is under construction as we speak. So we'll continue to look for opportunities to do that in Lee District and then also countywide, because this is an issue that is not just specific to our district. Thank you for the question.
Okay, Mr. Mendaro, would you like to add anything to that before I go to the next question?
I would just say that certainly I would agree. For many years, we've underfunded projects for trails and sidewalks. We have, though, over the last maybe 4 years, been increasing our baseline funding. It's certainly not sufficient to meet all of the needs, but there has been a concerted effort over the short term, and then that will continue once we come out of this to meet those requirements, because, again, we've got a significant backlog.
You do.
Okay, so I'm going to jump to a question now from Nicole Miller, and Nicole asked that we read her question. And just as a heads up, after Nicole's question, we'll read one more, and then Kathy Ledeck, we're coming to you. So Nicole asked a number of questions, and we'll get to we'll try to get to each of them, Nicole, but we're going to just go one at a time. And Nicole's question is the county. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the wrong one. I'm sorry. Just bear with us. Nicole, you asked a lot of questions. Is the county going to provide financial assistance to the complex that burnt down on Route 1? Will that be part of the budget? And will tax dollars be used for that? So that's one of Nicole's questions.
So that issue is being dealt with by the insurance company for that development. So if you think about this, just like at your own home, if there were a fire that happened at your home, you would make a claim against your insurance carrier so that they would be the ones that would help, make those repairs. So that process is currently underway. We're seeing some movement already. You can see that the structure, what remained of the building structure and the buildings have been brought down to what is essentially now the garage structure. So we'll start to see some movement on bringing down the concrete slabs and some of the rebar here once the next phase of their insurance comes in. So it's almost like they got the first phase to begin the demolition, and they'll move to the second phase. We anticipate that this project will move forward. We're doing everything we can to help expedite it through Fairfax County, through the permits review. The county's been extraordinary. We've identified one person to serve as the point so that any issues that are connected to that project can move forward in the most expeditious and timely manner. So at this point, I don't anticipate, and maybe Joe, you'll have to help me with this, but I anticipate that we'll be putting in county dollars. This should be handled as a private insurance matter.
Right.
Great. All right. Simple and straightforward. So I'm going to read Eric's question next because it was upvoted. And then after that, Kathy Ledeck will be coming to you. So you're on deck, Kathy. Eric's question, and this might be most specifically for you, Joe. Will people need to sign up again to speak at the budget hearings if they've already signed up? Or are they going to be queued now in the new digital format?
Yes. So thank you for that question. I should have mentioned that when I talked about the options. So staff starting, what is today, Thursday, probably yesterday, has been contacting all of the individuals who had signed up for the public hearings originally scheduled for the 14th, 15th, and 16th to do a couple of things. First of all, to make sure that they're aware that a new budget is out. And so the testimony that they provide should be based on that budget, not the February budget. Point them to those documents, et cetera. And explain the new time frame, the new schedule, and the new options, and get from them direction as to how they want to testify. If they want to upload a video, then give them those instructions. If they want to submit online, make sure they've got that link. Or if they want to be contacted via telephone, so they can talk to the board on the 14th, I'm sorry, the 28th, 29th, or 30th, have all that information. So each person who has signed up will be contacted directly by staff.
All right. It looks like Kathy is connecting. So while Kathy's connecting, I'm just going to ask a question that came in over email, and we got this from a couple people. And it's, where do things stand under the new budget proposal with the rollout of the body-worn cameras? I know that in the previous budget, there were some positions allocated that were necessary for reviewing that footage. For those who are in the audience who might not know, Supervisor Lusk is the chair of the Public Safety Committee, and this is something that we've been following closely. But folks are looking for an update on this. So maybe we could start with you, Joe, and then Supervisor Lusk, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. That's another good question in terms of an example of an initiative and how we've addressed it in the new budget. So because the board took action on rolling out the body-worn camera program at last carryover, so at the beginning of this fiscal year, that work has already begun. There was, as it was approved and begun, some one-time funding that was put in a carryover to make that happen this fiscal year. What we've done for FY21 is maintained that. We've had to add some money because, again, it was one-time funding, but that rollout that's occurring this year is going to be maintained. What that means is that the full rollout will be delayed a little bit. So rather than being fully implemented this year and in 21 and into 2022, it'll be a little bit later. But we're maintaining what's been approved this year and just putting that baseline funding in for 2021.
Supervisor Lusk, do you want to speak to that any further and maybe talk about the some of the work we've been doing around the body-worn camera rollout, give people a sense of the timeline and just where that project stands?
Well, so I think what Joe said is pretty much encapsulates the response. The thing I'll note is the next year, which would have been FY 2021, was for 3 additional police districts to be added, and then FY 2022 would have been the next 3, so we would have gotten all 9 of our magisterial districts online with the body-worn cameras. So what we're basically saying is that we're going to have to delay this at least a year. So FY 2022 would be the 3 police stations that would have come online in FY 2021, and then obviously out to 2023 for those second 3. I think this is something that the community is supportive of, and I think this is going to help build additional trust in the community having the body-worn cameras. So we definitely want to continue on this implementation. It's just unfortunate that we're in the situation that we're in. We just can't afford it at this time. But if things change, and maybe this is another thing that we can look at as we're going through this quarterly review, we might have the option to maybe program some additional dollars to allow that to happen sooner, possibly. But we'll have to look at where we are, at that point.
And just as one more point, in terms of the rollout, the plan, again, in those phases, as Supervisor Willis indicated, was to be to spread it out geographically around the county. And so the first phase, which again is being implemented this year, is the Reston Station, the Mason Station, and Mount Vernon Station. And so there'll be those portions of the county that will come online. And again, not all concentrated in one part, sort of spread out.
Okay, Kathy, it looks like you had a little bit of trouble connecting. We're going to re-prompt you if you can just follow the technical advice that our staff has given you on the side there. And while we wait, I'm going to read a question from Kay Ward, but Kathy, your invitation will be coming again soon. Kay's question was, the chairman of the Board of Supervisors asked each supervisor to identify the land use
Okay, here I am.
Oh, sorry. We'll come right back to you, Kathy. Just a minute. Yep. Okay. The chairman of the Board of Supervisors asked each supervisor to identify land use projects that are important to move forward through public hearings now. What projects are you and Supervisor Stork bringing forward for the Richmond Highway? Development moving forward will help us with our county coffers.
I fully agree with that point, and as many of you might be aware, we're working on a project right now, which is the Emerging Tech Project for Richmond Highway, to bring some emerging technologies to the corridor to help kind of seed the development and seeding of companies that can ultimately take physical space in office buildings on the corridor, and then ultimately to help us create some critical mass of different types of companies, whether they be in the areas of drone technologies or sensor technologies or others. So that's a priority of mine. Right now, we don't have any specific development proposals that we're reviewing for Historic Richmond Highway Corridor. We are looking at a number of things through the SSPA process, so the comp plan amendment process, and we're also looking at a number of things in Lee District also includes kind of Central Springfield. So I want to give a nod to Central Springfield too, recognizing that we need some additional development in that part of the county. So we're taking kind of a two-pronged approach here in Lee District and looking at ways to, outreach to the development community. We've already had meetings with a number of the owners of properties, both in Springfield and also on Richmond Highway. So we're having some pretty detailed questions and conversations about what we can do along the corridor and what we can do in Central Springfield. And then the last point I'll make is the county's looking at a tax abatement proposal that I'm very, very eager about, and I think it's going to really be a big tool that we can use to help incentivize development along the corridor, and specifically to help us get some of the embark recommendations to fruition. And I would say this will also have some applicability in that it's being used in the revite areas. So Springfield is also a revitalization area. So we'll have the opportunity to deploy it there as well. So stay tuned on that tax abatement program, and stay tuned on future developments along the corridor and in Central Springfield. We are very much focused on this. So thank you for the question.
Okay. Joe, do you want to add anything to that before we move on to the next question?
No, I think that does it.
Okay. So we're going to go to Kathy Ledeck next for a question. She'll be up in a second, Kathy. I also just wanted to let people know we're about at the halfway point for Kathy, before we bring you on, if you could try to find a pair of headphones to stop any audio feedback. If you have a pair of headphones, that'd be great. If you could just take a peek real quick. Okay, well, we'll give it a shot in a second. But we're about at the halfway point. So if you have not asked a question yet and there's something you want answered, now's the time to drop it in. If not, we will read some questions out from folks who've already been able to ask them, because there are a few more left in the queue. We have another hour scheduled, and we'll just go till we've answered everybody's questions. Kathy, we're going to go to you. Maybe if you could turn your volume down on your computer while you ask it. That might help a little bit. So over to you, Kathy.
Thank you so much for the technical support, and apologies for any audio feedback that you have. I have a general comment first. I just want to say how lucky are we to live in Fairfax County, where we have reserves and other funds available to cover costs during this very challenging time. I want to thank Supervisor Lusk and Mr. Mondoro for all of your work to support all county residents. So my question relates to whether or not the county is moving ahead to take advantage of funding available to local governments from the recently approved federal COVID-19 relief packages. Of course, we don't know yet how long the COVID-19 situation will continue, but it does appear that Fairfax County might be eligible in a number of different areas, and this could provide significant relief. I should also mention that this should include the Fairfax County Park Authority, which is also incurring adverse impacts to its budget from COVID-19. So will the county be seeking reimbursement from the feds also for the small business loan program that you described, Joe? Thank you very much for hosting this forum and for hearing my questions.
Sure. So a couple of things. First of all, yes, we are absolutely actively pursuing all of the funding opportunities that are being made available. As you might imagine, as they're announced, they're oftentimes light with details in terms of sort of the next steps to access them. One thing we do know about the large federal appropriation for local governments is that local governments over 500,000 in population are allowed to apply on their own as opposed to going through their state. And so that is potentially advantageous to us. And so we're working on figuring out what those details are. As I mentioned at the outset, one of the challenges potentially is that the way, as we understand it, the way the legislation was written, it was intended for reimbursement. And while reimbursement will be helpful to us, at this point, our anticipation is that the biggest impact, the biggest negative impact on the county is going to be lost revenues. And so Representative Conley is working to try to expand the eligibility to revenues. That's, again, the large pot. There are lots of other smaller pots, among them the small business that you referenced. HUD has funding for programs, as I mentioned, and yes, staff is actively pursuing them. We have, as part of our Office of Emergency Management, a very talented group of people who are very successful in navigating the reimbursement process for disasters. Typically, the funds come to us as a result of a natural disaster. And I think this is going to be different in terms of the parameters, but those staff are on it and are tracking the costs that are eligible so that we have all of the information that we need to provide in our submission to make sure that we're as successful as possible in getting those funds. One other thing that I'd add that is of a little concern, but certainly it will work through, typically reimbursements are very slow in coming. We have examples, and again, these are primarily weather related, of getting reimbursements 4 or 5 years after the event. We are hopeful that that's not going to be the case this time. And so again, trying to get to the front of the line in terms of the timing of making the request so that whatever the time frame in terms of making the awards is as short as possible.
I'll just add one little point, and thank you, Joe, for that. It's critical that we recover as much as we can from both the state and the federal programs. The one thing I wanted to note is with that small loan program that we referenced earlier, I think it could also be helpful in providing loans to people that might not qualify for SBA loans. And I think this is an area that we definitely need to be thinking about. Small business is the backbone of our community here in Fairfax County. Over 90% of our businesses are small businesses. We need them to survive. We need them to thrive. They are providing critical employment options and opportunities for people here in the county, and we need to ensure that we're supporting them as best we can. So when we talk about this item at our next Board of Supervisors meeting on April 14th, I'm going to make sure that we are thinking about ensuring that this loan program supports those who might not qualify for those SBA loan programs.
All right. We're going to move to a question now from John, who asked that we read it on screen. It's pretty straightforward. John wants to know, will there be any funding changes to FCPS adult continuing education? Joe, can you give us any insight on that as a line item, perhaps?
So in terms of the county's transfer to schools, it does not typically, it does not by state code, go to specific programs. It is a lump sum transfer. There are some very large categories that the county can opine on, but those specific decisions will be made by the school board as they start their deliberations. And again, they've got their public hearing scheduled at this point for May 11th, 12th, and 13th.
Okay. All right. I'm going to give a very disappointed wag of the finger to Holly Doherty. Holly Doherty, you know how to do this because you've been on our previous question in the wrong spot. So shame on you, Holly, but I'm going to read it anyway. Holly just wanted to flag basically the need, and for anyone who doesn't know, Holly is from the Mount Vernon Lead Chamber of Commerce, and she wants to know if there's anything that we might be looking at to give interim relief to small businesses in Fairfax County. So in the short term, Joe, is there anything in this budget that is specifically aimed at the small business community here in the county?
Yes. And so, again, focusing on sort of the current, the board will have a proposal to take action on next Tuesday that will release funds for small business loans as early as next week.
Yep.
There'll be a program that will be coordinated with the Community Business Partnership, which already has a small business loan program in place. And so the thought was the funding could be provided to them through the EDA, which is their funding source, and then they'd be able to implement immediately because they've got the mechanism in place to do so.
Supervisor Lusk, can you just also talk about a little bit about what we've been working on specific to South County to support small businesses, and maybe just give a little bit of a preview for some information we're actually going to be releasing either later today or early tomorrow morning to help share resources from SFDC?
Yeah, so we've been working with Mr. Evan Kaufman at SFDC, their executive director, on a proposal which I think is pretty visionary and certainly important, which is to support small businesses along the corridor who are open, letting people know that they're open, especially those that are in the restaurant and hospitality areas, to have them share menus, have them share information on specials that they might be offering. So we have started a survey kind of process. He's basically put this up online. He's getting feedback from companies. And what we'd like to do, which we just began working on yesterday, is we're going to create about a 45-second video that we're going to help disseminate over Facebook and some of the other social media outlets to let the companies along the Richmond Highway corridor know that there's an opportunity for them to share information, to get connected to this SFDC kind of program and process, so that they can let others in the community know, what specials and what things that they are doing at this time. What I also like that Evan has talked about is having kind of like a pledge from the community to support small businesses, not saying you have to ink it in blood, but just having folks acknowledge that they're going to spend at least $25 or $30 per week with a small business, just to help those businesses weather this very difficult time. And I'll say we're also working with the folks at the Greater Springfield Chamber of Commerce as well. And then Holly Doherty has been very active in this effort, and I think she might still be on. So I want to recognize her for this as well. But this is something you'll be seeing as early as Friday or Monday, Matt?
Maybe today. Yeah, we'll see. We're working real hard on it. Okay,
that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So just a final reminder, if you have not asked a question and there's a question you want to get in, now's the time to share it. I'm going to go back and I'm going to read a question again from Nicole Miller, who submitted a few, but this is a good question. This actually came up also at Supervisor Walter Alcorn's from the Hunter Mill District, his town hall last night. And I think that it's probably something that folks in Lee District are also interested in. So Nicole's question is, can we find ways to give teachers the raises that they deserve? Teachers need more money. To entice people to come here and be teachers, we need to give them raises, show them we can still reward them. And I know that the dynamic is particularly interesting here, Supervisor Luskin. It's something that you've talked about a lot in regards to neighboring jurisdictions and what they pay teachers, and then the amount of how it affects our school system. We educate children here and they move away, and then all of the dynamics included in it. So
it's a very good point. I'll start. I'll say Karen Garza, who was the former superintendent of the schools, brought forward this point when she was here, and it became very clear that we were falling behind in our teacher pay, especially at the introductory level of teaching. And for those entry-level teachers, they were not being paid the same as entry-level teachers, say, in Prince George's or Arlington or even Alexandria. And it became clear that we needed to take some steps, because we were starting to see flight of our teachers from Fairfax County, ones that we had trained, ones that were very good to our system, going to Arlington, going to Alexandria, going to Prince William and Washington, D.C. So I know that the school board has been working this issue over the last few years. We've gotten to a place now where we're not at the bottom of this pay scale for entry-level teachers. We've got to continue to be vigilant on this point. I would say that it's a competitive market, and we want to keep our best teachers here in Fairfax County because they're educating our students and preparing them for future responsibilities that we want them to, enjoy here in Fairfax. So I'm definitely going to be a proponent or an advocate of making sure that we, support our teachers in a way that they are being competitively paid. I think with this budget, I mean, I can't speak to what the schools have in mind, and I know we just released the budget, so they're going to have to go through a process themselves, similar to the process that we are going through in terms of making a amendment to their original budget. And I think they're going to be meeting, if I'm correct, they're meeting right now, having this conversation. So we'll have to stay tuned and see kind of how that plays out with compensation and other things. But clearly, I recognize the importance of it and don't want us to become uncompetitive.
Okay. Mr. Bandura, do you want to add anything to that one?
I would just emphasize the point that Supervisor Lusk made in terms of the multi-year commitment that had been made and had been funded to address the fact that we had fallen behind relative to local competitors. And so as a result of those investments, the commitment of both the school board and the board of supervisors to make those investments, we are in a much better funding position relative to our peers than we had been. I think that the challenge this year will be that there really is not the flexibility to continue in terms of pay increases. But I think that the commitment is there, and the long-term demonstration of that commitment from the board in terms of funding will be maintained once we get past this period.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I want to give a lot of props to everyone who managed to migrate over here from the other session before we had technical difficulties. But one question, unfortunately, did get left behind. So thanks to our staff for going back and digging that up. And I'm going to read it now. So this was a question that was asked before we transitioned over. And this is from Stephen Levinson. Stephen, I don't know if you're with us. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to invite you, but I just got this question. So Stephen's question is, where does the sales tax for online sales go? You forecast in the budget a shortfall due to store closures. Most of the revenue was shifted to online.
So as a result of a recent, I guess it was about 18 months ago, Supreme Court decision called the Wayfair decision, revenues that are online sales tax revenues that are paid do flow to the state in which they are paid. Sales tax in Virginia is an interesting dynamic. So there's a 1% local option of sales tax that flows to us. There's a much larger reliance on sales tax for schools than the county. The money that flows through us is based on purchases within Fairfax County. The money that flows to schools is based on purchases. It's an allocation of the statewide sales tax. And that's probably a detail that no one cares about, but a budget analyst. The reality of the sales tax dynamic is certainly there's a shift from brick and mortar. There has been, and there's continuing to be a shift from brick and mortar to online. I think the challenge is that overall the volume is projected to drop. So, for example, big ticket items, it appears, are not being purchased, and so furniture, that kind of thing. So it's anticipated that there is, in fact, going to be a decline. Yes, there'll be a change in terms of the vendor, and yes, those sales that do occur online will flow to us. But overall, the volume is anticipated to decline, and so the amount of sales tax flowing will decline as well.
Okay, well, what I'm going to do now is probably go ahead and put a pause on this. Everybody who has asked a question has got at least a couple of theirs answered. I'm going to turn it over to Joe for any closing remarks or thoughts that he wants to leave us with for a moment. If there's anything else you want to make us aware of, Joe, if anybody wants to squeeze in a question while Joe's speaking, we'll try to get in. But then after that, we'll go to Supervisor Lux. So, Joe, anything you'd like to leave us with?
So again, just to reiterate, the dates have changed. The public hearings on the 28th, 29th, and 30th. All of the information relative to the budget and how to sign up if you haven't already is on the county website, fairfaxcounty.gov. If you have signed up, staff will be contacting you to determine how you want to participate. The process is going to be, a little bit more complicated with the online, but the intent is that we hear from everyone so that the board has a fully informed set of information to make their ultimate decision on May 12th. Thank you again for having me.
Supervisor Lusk.
Okay, I'll say thank you to Joe Maduro as well for being here and being able to answer these questions so capably. So appreciate all the hard work that you and the senior team are doing, and the employees here in Fairfax County. We're very fortunate to have them, and I think about our first responders and really the work that they're doing at this time is just exceptional. We're very blessed. We're very fortunate in this county that we have such committed staff, and I just want to reiterate that. For the budget, I'll say please feel free to reach out to me with any additional concerns. We're going to keep record of the questions and the issues that have come in even through this process, but I want to be honest and clear in saying that if there are other things that you want to reach out to us on, please feel free to do that. We are open to hearing suggestions and concerns. I think the hard thing is this budget is like no other budget. And the position that the county is in is one of pretty significant uncertainty, but we're going to weather this. I know the county's been through some tough budget years in the past. We've been able to weather those. We will weather this. And I'll say thank you again for everything you're doing with regard to slowing down the spread of the coronavirus. Continue social distancing, washing your hand, continue staying at home as much as you can. These things are making a difference. And then lastly, I'll say if you ever need to reach us, I'll give you first our phone number. It's 703-971-6262. And if you want to reach us by email, you can just send it to leedist@fairfaxcounty.gov. And again, thank you for participating in our virtual budget town hall, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the near future. Thank you.
And as we go, I will just give a plug in the chat. You'll see now we've dropped a survey, so you can let us know how we did. If you have suggestions for doing these in the future, we'll probably be doing them at least in the near term as frequently as possible. And we've also provided a direct link for the email address the Supervisor Lusk just read off. So if there's additional follow-up questions you have, send them through, and our staff will get to work on them. Thanks for joining us.